I'm very delighted to already welcome our first speaker, Karin Pallaver, who will give a historical perspective on work in Tanzania. She is an associate professor of African history and located at the University of Bologna. Previously, and this is quite impressive to me, she has also been a researcher to the British Museum. Her area of interest covers social and economic aspects of history in the 19th century, which means also early colonialism in East Africa and the pre-colonial time, like African trade, colonialism, and female workers. She has been published several books and chapters and articles. It's quite an impressive list where she has been involved in different projects. One of the projects which I found very interesting is that she's been a co-investigator in the project of Women at Work for a comparative history of African female urban professioning, looking at female workers in Sudan, Tanzania, and Ghana. And I'm looking forward, Karin, that you prepared a presentation for us, giving us an idea about the history of work and labor in Tanzania, which will endure about 15 to 25 minutes. And then we will have the chance to deepen the topic and discuss with Karin. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. And then afterwards, I will pick up your questions. Karin, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Helena, for this introduction, very generous introduction. So I will now try to share my screen. Can you see?
It looks perfect. Yes, we do see.
And I can see you as well. So I won't do myself on my own, as it always happens. That's very nice to see you. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here today evening. I didn't know the Tanzania network. Now I know, and I really... Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. It's really good that this kind of information is made on African countries, and especially on Tanzania here in Europe. I've given this title to my presentation, that is the history of labor in Tanzania, an overview from 1850 to 1970. And as you can see and you can imagine, this is a very long period of history during which many things happened in the history of Tanzania and in the history of labor in Tanzania. So necessarily, this will be a broad overview of most important historical processes in terms of the labor history of Tanzania. And then we can deepen some of the topics that I will raise during my presentation during the question time. So some preliminary remarks that will give us a broad framework into which situated the historical processes that I will discuss today evening. The first one is that, as I've said, many things happened in the history of labor in Tanzania over this period, but what remains true for the entire period under scrutiny until today is that the majority of people in Tanzania has always been employed in what economists call the primary sector, so agriculture. Even if there have been changes, and there has been in recent years a decrease of the people employed in agriculture, this is has been the main occupation of workers in Tanzania. And with agriculture, I mean food production, subsistence food production, and also production for export, of course. The secondary sector with which economists intend factory labor, mine labor, has developed, started to develop, especially during the colonial period and of course in the post-independence period, but it has been limited compared to the primary sector. And we also have a little development of the tertiary sector, but this has started to increase significantly after independence in many sectors, as we will see. I thought that it would be practical to structure my presentation following a chronological structure. So I have divided my analysis in three main chronological periods. The first one is the 19th century, and especially from mid-19th century to the end of the 19th century, when we have a huge development of long-distance trade in Tanzania, as we will see, that had important consequences in terms of labor. Then the colonial period, the German colonial period, so from 1885, so to say, so the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference until the First World War, and then the British colonial period, when the Great Britain got a mandate from the League of Nations on what they called the Tanganyika territory, so from the First World War until independence. And finally, the post-independence period, and especially the African socialism and the Ujamaa policy by President Nyerere. To this chronological structure, I would like to draw your attention to one thing that I think is very important in the history of Tanzania and in terms of the labor history of Tanzania, that is visible in this graph, from which we can see the percentage of the female population in Tanzania. And we can see that for the entire period that we will analyze today evening, women have been the majority of the population of Tanzania. And so this means that more female workers were in the country compared to male workers. So it is important when we think about the history of labor in Tanzania that we consider female labor and how it was related, and as we will see in many instances also complementary to male labor. And of course, to analyze female labor, we need to adopt a broad definition of labor. So not only waged labor, of course, but all the labor that women performed at home. So in housekeeping, in childcare, in food production, on the top of other kind of occupations. So let's start from the 19th century. That is a period, especially starting from mid-19th century, of huge changes in the economy of what would become Tanzania later on, and changes also in the global connections of the country to the global markets. And these were due to the development of the export of one commodity that was East African ivory, ivory that was exported to the Western world, so to North America and to Europe and also to India. And East African ivory was very precious because it was softer than Indian ivory or West African ivory. And so it was more easy to carve it. And so it was used, especially in the Western world, in India to make jewelry, in the Western world to make all sorts of objects like the ones you can see in this picture, like card figures or handles of forks and knives, and other objects, umbrella handles, piano keys, and so on, billiard balls, and so on and so forth. And these ivory objects were used by the Western middle class that was growing at the time as a way to show their social status. So having ivory objects was a way to show social wealth and economic wealth. And so there was a huge increase in the export of ivory from East Africa that led to the establishment of caravan routes, trade routes that connected the coast of Tanzania to the interior regions where ivory was obtained by traders. And second export that developed significantly in the 19th century and that connected more and more the interior regions with the coast was that in enslaved people that were employed as workers in the plantations that developed along the coast, as well as in the plantations that were established in Zanzibar, and especially clove plantations. So this meant that we have an important increase in unfree labor, because of course these enslaved people were enslaved to work in the plantations. And these were largely men that were captured in the interior, taken to the coast and employed in the plantations. Slavery was, of course, not introduced in the 19th century. It was already there. Slaves, however, were mainly women, and women were employed as in the fields. They were employed as domestic helpers and servants along the coast, especially in the Swahili city towns. But what we have in the 19th century with this development of plantations in Zanzibar and along the coast was an increase in the employment of male laborers. But an important impact that the development of long-distance trade, and especially the ivory trade, was the development of a new class of laborers that were human porters, the pagazi, as they are called in Kiswahili. Because the only way to carry goods from the interior regions to the coast was to have porters who carried the goods and the ivory tusks, because no railways existed, of course, at the time, but also draft and pack animals couldn't be used because of the tsetse fly that is fatal to animals. And so only human porters could be used. And so the development of long-distance trade led to a huge development of the number of porters that were employed. And these porters received a wage in exchange for their labor. This wage was negotiated by porters. The biggest part of them were coming from the Unyamwezi region in Western Tanzania. And these wages were not paid in coins, but were paid in commodity currencies that were used as money in Tanzania at the time, especially glass beads from Venice and American cloth that was called Americani, that was used to pay wages. And so this is a very peculiar characteristic of the labor history of Tanzania, not only of Tanzania, but of the entire African continent, because here we have a very early development of wage labor. Wage labor was almost non-existent in Africa before the colonial period. But in Tanzania, human porters were received a wage, were waged workers. They also did strikes if working conditions were not good. So we have a very early development in the African continent of wage labor in the form of human porterage. But if men were employed in the caravans, what were the consequences on women? We can see from this picture that women also worked as porters in the caravans. They generally either accompanied their husbands and did domestic work along during the travel, during the trip that could last several months. So they cooked and washed the clothes and so on and so forth. But they also worked as porters. They carried small loads, and men carried more heavy loads. And so sometimes also women received as a wage because they worked as porters. So we have also an early development of female wage labor, very uncommon in Africa at the time. Given that so many men, especially from the Unyamwezi region, were employed as porters, the consequence was that there were less men who could work in agriculture in the interior regions where porters came from. And as a consequence, there was an increase in slavery, also in the interior regions, because women were enslaved and bought with the money that porters obtained from their work in the caravans to replace men in the field and help the women who remained at home. And finally, in terms of trade, we see a complementary relationship between men and women, because long distance trade was generally done by men, so the trade in ivory and enslaved people, whereas small and regional trade was generally done by women, who also sold their surplus produced in the fields. They sold it to the caravans that were formed of hundreds or even thousands of porters. The colonial period. So when the Germans colonized the area, one of the first things that they needed to do was to build transport infrastructures to replace porters, because porters were expensive to hire, and also the trips with the goods lasted many months. So the Germans started to build railways. The Usambara railway connecting Tanga to Moshi was initiated in 1891 and completed. It reached Moshi in 1911, whereas the central caravan road, the central railway that followed the path of the central caravan road, the one followed by porters, connecting Kigoma on Lake Tanganyika to Dar es Salaam on the coast, was inaugurated in 1912. So this had consequences in terms of labor, because laborers had to be hired to build the railway and to run the railway. And it was always difficult for the German colonial state to find laborers who were willing to work for a wage, because working conditions were not that good, wages were not very high. And so to solve the problem, indentured laborers, so laborers hired on a contract, were imported into German East Africa, as Tanzania was called at the time, from China especially. But of course, the building of the railway had an important impact on porterage, because the number of porters was significantly reduced. In 1900, just to give you some data, in 1900, 35,000 porters arrived on the coast, and almost 44,000 left for the interior. In 1913, so the year after the opening of the railway, only 190 porters reached the coast. So this meant that the railway replaced human porters in long-distance trade, even if porters continued to be used in the areas that were far from the railway, of course. And during World War I, for instance, when the war, as you know, was fought in German East Africa, porters were crucial, were critical for the German army. So we have in this period an exceptional demand, an exceptional labor demand, because there was the building of infrastructures, but porters continue to be in demand. And we have the early development of the colonial economy with plantations, especially in sisal, in cotton, in coffee, that require the employment of laborers, and especially male laborers who were employed in the plantations. and also domestic service especially for German settlers and German families that established in German East Africa, and the biggest part of domestic servants were men.
Karin, 5 to 8 more minutes.
Okay.
I know you still have some slides. This is why I give you a time
Yes,
mark.
thank you very much. What women did during the colonial period in terms of labor, of course, women were not targeted as wage laborers or regular wage laborers as men were. And so they were generally hired when as casual laborers in the plantations and in railway construction as piece workers when there was an exceptional intensity of the labor demand, for instance, in the harvesting season. So women were hired, but for short periods. Also, as a consequence of urbanization, and especially during the British colonial period, Dar es Salaam expanded significantly. There was an increase of women who went to towns and worked as sex workers because men migrated to towns without their wives, without their families. And so there was an imbalanced sex ratio in the towns. And so there was the development of sex work. Overall, what happened during the colonial period was that the colonial legislation limited the mobility of female laborers outside the district where they resided, because they wanted women to take care of subsistence food production. So, of course, there was a difficult balance to maintain in terms of agriculture between the production for export, that was the backbone of the colonial economy, and the production of food that was needed to maintain the population of the colony, as well as male laborers. And women had the task in the colonial project to produce food for the colony. During the British colonial period, basically, the same processes remained at place, even if we have an expansion of the export economy, agricultural exports, so the export of cash crops, and so a gradual expansion and stabilization of the waged labor force, even if wage workers continue to remain a minority in terms of the working population. We have also the development of factory labor in some urban areas, but still factory labor remain limited. And again, what we see is that formal wage labor continue to be not that attractive in terms of working conditions, because laborers had to migrate to far away from home to work in the plantations, and wages continued to be not very high. Women continue to be employed as casual laborers in agriculture. They were not wage laborers as men were. And we also see a wage discrimination, going back to what Helena was saying before about equal work, where women were already during the colonial period paid less than men in terms of wages. And also they had little access to skilled labor because they had limited access to education. Just think that in 1946 there were 917 secondary schools in Tanganyika, and no girls were enrolled. And in 1953 only 7 girls were enrolled. Last historical period is the post-colonial period and the Ujamaa President Julius Nyerere supported the women and the role that women could have in the society of independent Tanzania, both in politics and in the economy. And women profited in many ways from the new opportunities that were offered by the independent state. They established shop, maize mills, beer halls, and so on and so forth. At the same time, however, especially in the rural areas, the workload for women increased because communal labor in the Ujamaa villages that were established by President Nyerere added to food production and childcare that women had already to perform. But also the strong focus that the government of President Nyerere put on social development and social welfare created new opportunities for women in terms of their access to secondary education. And especially they became waged workers as teachers and in schools and nurses in hospitals that were established as part of the Ujamaa policy. Just a point that I would like to make is urbanization. Since the 1940s, as I have mentioned, so already since the colonial period, we have a huge increase of the urban population of Tanzania and migration from rural areas to urban areas. And just think that from 1965 to 1988, Tanzania had the second highest rate of urban growth in the world. And the total urban population increased over 10 times from 1967 to 2002. So this has, of course, important consequences in terms of the development of what we can call the informal economy or unemployment in the urban areas. So to conclude, as I'm running out of time, as I've mentioned at the beginning, over the period under scrutiny, the large majority of people have always been employed in agriculture. But we have seen in recent years from labor surveys as well as from censuses, national censuses, that this percentage has been increasing. Also, Tanzania is characterized by this very early development of wage labor in terms of porterage, and this makes Tanzania an exception in the history of the African continent in the pre-colonial period. Wage labor started to increase during the colonial period. We see a stabilization and increase of waged laborers, but wage labor has never become the most important labor relation in the history of the country. And finally, women, as we have seen, have played a crucial role in the history of labor in Tanzania, as not only in terms of wage workers and as being an impermanent source of labor for colonial plantations or railway construction, but also in terms of the work they put daily in food production, in housekeeping, and in child care. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Karin. That was a fantastic presentation and a wonderful overview, starting from the pre-colonial time, having enslaved people, the porters, to the labor. And I really loved especially how you focused also on women and the crucial role they played in labor. I see some people applauding, so this is your applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Meanwhile, if there are any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I'm happy to ask them to Karin to deepen some of the aspects she has mentioned. And while you're still typing, I have one question to start with. because at the beginning I was wondering that you didn't say slaves, but you used the term enslaved people. Could you explain why did you choose to take this term?
Yes, this is a very interesting question. When you talk about a slave, it's like you are talking about a person who is just that. It's only a slave, and so in many ways, you take away from this person what we call the agency. So the possibility to act as a person. And it's like this person is a slave and only a slave. And this is very, I mean, if you think about slaves in the plantations in the Americas working in the cotton production or tobacco production, you have this idea that they could not have choices. They were only slaves. But if you talk as a person who has been enslaved, then you give this person back his or her own agency. So she or he is not only a slave, it is a person that has been enslaved. And so being enslaved, she can or he can also become something else. He, she can resist, he, she can react to this condition. And for the same reason we talk academics, we talk about enslavers and not owners, slave owners, because you do not only own these people, you are enslaving, so making an act of violence in enslaving people. So this is the way academics now prefer to call the slaves.
And I think this is quite an interesting thing, which should not only stay in academics, but might also be something for us working, many of us working in partnership groups and are engaged in groups. And I think it's always about hierarchies and wording and who has the agency and who not. So thank you very much for this good explanation. I will try to keep it up to now focus on enslaved people instead of slaves.
It's the same as we say disabled or a person with a disability. So it's only part of that person. It's not the person itself.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we got some questions in the chat. The first one, thanks a lot for the great presentation. And the person would like to know, when did the number of female secondary school students starts to increase? And maybe the second one you can answer in the same term. Can you give a brief definition of employment? Because we talked about terms.
Yes, yeah. I thought about this when I was preparing my presentation, because of course, being a same word issue of words we use, employment requires to have an employer, and so I do not mean I have adopted a broad definition of employment in this presentation. So how you employ your time in working, so to say. So not necessarily having an employer who pays you, because you can even be self-employed. And so people who are women working or producing food for the porters, for the caravans, are self-employed, but we call this we call this employment. For participation of women and girls in secondary schools, starting the 1950s, when there was the colonial state started to rethink about its role in the colonies, and they put more money and they invested more in education and social welfare as a response to the development of resistance, anti-colonial resistance, political resistance in the colonies, in Tanzania, in this case, and African politicians and intellectuals asked for more investments in education and health, for instance. So this also saw an increase in the number of women enrolled in the secondary schools. Very few none of them actually went to study abroad in the universities as other other African students, male African students did, such as, for instance, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya or Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. So this is one of the reasons why they had a little role in politics, or a high important role in politics after independence.
I will come to the next question. In which way do you see an influence of the history of labor on today's job market and gender distribution in Tanzania? Could you maybe also say something about the role of unions in Tanzania?
Yes. So in terms of labor, labor nowadays in Tanzania, I think that what I see, of course, new forms of labor have new forms of labor have developed, especially, as I was mentioning at the end of my presentation, in the urban areas, and this huge increase in migration, and especially female migration to the urban areas, and the development of the so-called informal economy, and also the development of unemployment that did not exist during the colonial period, or it was not defined as such. Also, a connection that I see with the present situation of labor in Tanzania is this continuous and important role of women in the economy, and especially in agriculture. And according to last national censuses, we have more and more women who are also head of the household, so are heading the agricultural production on the household level, also agricultural production for trade and for export. And of course, we see more and more an expansion of the demand for laborers in the service sector, so in the tertiary sector, thanks to the expansion of education. And here we see probably unemployment also in relation to the level of education of people that has increased significantly, also thanks to the large investments that were made since independence in education in the country.
Meanwhile, there's a new question in the chat concerning the pre-colonial period and the early forms of waged work. Could you say a bit more about how forms of forced labor existed side by side with forms of waged labor? And what role did the introduction of the new currencies like Amerikanische cloth and glass beads play? I mean, we had this like informal and formal work, and some of them were actually paid, others not. Could you elaborate a little bit more about this?
Yeah, in terms of forced labor, we have enslaved people who were forced to work, and they were bought with Amerikanische cloth, especially. Porters instead were free laborers that received these wages, and basically the introduction of these currencies had important consequences on the accumulation of wealth, for instance. So people who in the interior, or chiefs who traded with the coast, could acquire a lot of Amerikanische cloth or glass beads that they used to by other slaves, or they used to build political relationships with other chiefs. So they basically had an important consequence in the monetization of the economy, as well as of social relations and accumulation of wealth. So people who owned glass beads or owned imported cloth were wealthy people, economically and politically, and also had an important social status that they could that you could spend in political relationships in the interior regions.
Great, thank you very much. There's one more question in the chat, but the one who asked that one, I can tell you there will be more about the internet offering influences on present labor situation like click workers. We will focus on this during our next session at the end of the week. Meanwhile, I would like to ask a last question to you, Karin, which actually kind of shifts over to the next part of today's seminar. Later on, we will split into 2 breakout sessions, and one of the present breakout sessions will talk about archives to film and also focus about child labor. Therefore, I think it would be interesting to know how and what child labor worked in the past, before and during the colonial period, and after independence. So when we talk about child labor, from what age do we mean young people working? And could you maybe elaborate a little bit about child labor during pre-colonial and colonial time up to today?
Yeah. So we have children. We have historical evidence of children traveling with the caravans and helping their parents to carry small loads or kitchen tools during these long journeys, as of course female caravan porters took their children with them, and also children helped in the fields and in the food production, so were worked in the household with their families. During the colonial period, there were a lot of what the colonial state called in the statistics juveniles, that were boys and girls under the apparent age of 16. 16 was the age in which men had to start paying taxes, so they were considered as adults. But juveniles were employed in the plantations, and children were also employed in the plantations to do light work, so to say. And according to surveys that were made after independence and the International Labour Office, children have been always employed as laborers, and in this International Labour Organization statistics, there are data on children over the age of 10. So over the age of 10, children are considered